thank you everyone for joining us here. Really excited to present this dialogue conversation this morning. Well, sorry, this afternoon for you. I'm over in late morning over here in Pacific Standard Time. And so this session is GASP, Writing as Reparative Care, with Nourbese Philip and Leanne Betamasosake Simpson. And we're thinking and discussing today writing as reparative care, and we're taking off on some tangents. This is just some broad topics that we're sort of looking at. So how can writing be reparative? What role does writing play in care? Care as a political act that demonstrates our witnessing and engagement with stories from our communities, with our stories. How does writing live in us, and how does it maybe care for us? This is a conversation with award-winning authors Nourbese Philip and Leanne Betamasosake Simpson, moderated today with curator Andrea Fatona. So thank you all of you for bringing this critical and engaging discussion this afternoon, morning.
Thank you. It's a pleasure being here.
Sorry, Andrea, you're muted.
Geez. Thank you everyone for being here, and especially thank you, Leanne and Nourbese, for being here. I'd also like to really thank the organizing committee of Contingencies of Care for pulling together with such care this amazing residency. Most of all, I'd like to thank the folks who developed the platform for us to be in conversation with each other and to be in connection. I think this is a really, really important moment for all of us, given COVID, given our distancing from each other. And it's really interesting to me that these two women, these two amazing writers that we'll be in conversation with are folks I've known of and have been in close proximity. I've worked with Nourbese, I've lived in the same territory as Leanne, and have always wanted to have this connection, and this moment has forced us into it. So I'm very grateful for it. So I'm going to give you, just read the bios of both of our writers, and then I'll walk you through the way in which the session will unfold. So Leanne is a renowned Michi-Sagi Anishinaabe scholar, writer, artist, and widely recognized as one of the compelling Indigenous voices of her generation, story and song, bringing audiences into a rich and layered world of sound, light, and sovereign activities, creativity. Working 2 decades as an independent scholar using Anishinaabe intellectual practices, Leanne has lectured and taught extensively at universities across Canada and the United States, and has 20 years experience in Indigenous land-based education. She holds a PhD from the University of Manitoba and teaches at the Descenta Center for Research and Learning in Denebe. Leanne is the author of 5 previous books, including The Accident of Being Lost, which won the MacEwan University Book of the Year, and was finalist for the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Book Award. Longlisted for the CBC Canada Reads, and was named a Best Book of the Year by the Globe and Mail, the National Post, and Quill Choir. Her latest book, As We Have Always Done, Indigenous Freedom Through Radical Resistance, was published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2017 and was awarded Best Subsequent Book by the Native American and Indigenous Studies Association. Her novel Pumengmeng, The Cure for White Ladies, is forthcoming from the House of Anansi in the fall of 2020. Nourbese. Nourbese is an embedded poet, essayist, novelist, playwright, and independent scholar who lives in the space-time of the city of Toronto, where she practiced law for 7 years before becoming a poet and writer. Among her published works are the seminal She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks, a speculative prose poem, Looking for Langston, An Odyssey of Silence, the young adult novel Harriet's Daughter, the play Coups and Calypso, and 4 collections of essays, including her most recent book, Blank. Her book-length poem, Zong, is a conceptually innovative, genre-breaking epic which explodes the legal archive as it relates to slavery. Among her awards are numerous Canada Council and Ontario Arts Council grants, including the prestigious Chalmers Award from the Ontario Arts Council, the Canada Council's Victor Martin Lynch Stoughton Award for Outstanding Mid-Career Artist, as well as the Pushcart Prize from the US, the Las Casas, the Casas de las Americas Prize, Cuba, and the Lawrence Foundation Prize. The Arts Foundation of Toronto Writing and Publishing Award and Dora Award. She's also held numerous fellowships. For this session, both of our writers have agreed to share a piece of each other's writing to set the tone for the discussion. And so I'll ask them to start by choosing the piece of writing they intend to read, and I'll ask Leanne to start, please.
Bonjour, Kinawaya. It's an honor to be here today in cyberspace with all of you. I'm going to be reading from Nourbese's amazing essay, Gasp. We all begin life in water. We all begin life because someone once breathed for us. Until we breathe for ourselves, someone breathes for us. Everyone has had someone, a woman, breathe for them until that first gasp for air. We begin life in a prepositional relationship with breath. Someone breathes for us. We continue that prepositional relationship, breathing for ourselves until we can no longer do so. And it appears that this most fundamental of acts is always a contingent one, breathing for, with, instead of, and into. Survival demands that we learn to breathe for ourselves, but the sine qua non of our existence is that first extended act of breathing, a breathing for and being breathed for in utero. We can perhaps call it a form of circular breathing or even circle breathing. Are there wider theoretical and possible therapeutic implications to breathing for someone and allowing someone to breathe for you? Further, how do the prepositional modifications change these implications? Is breathing for the same as breathing with or instead of? Finally, while I breathe is semantically complete, its completion would not be possible without that original prepositional act of breathing for. These are the thoughts that surface on reflection a few months after listening to Nathaniel McKay's inaugural Creeley lecture from SUNY in Buffalo in the spring of 2016. In the moment, as I listened to him, my memories ran along parallel tracks, thinking of my own very different arc of coming to voice and therefore breath. After observing that Creeley discovered that reading poetry out loud often required a conscious manipulation of breath. Mackie takes us through the idea of precarity as it affects African Americans, referencing the now tragically iconic phrase by Eric Gardner, "I can't breathe," as he explains the technique and use of circular breathing in music, all of it grounded in and illustrated by musical samples of jazz. My memories take me back to my early years in Canada and the beginnings of my very tentative presumption that I might have something to say that others would listen to or be interested in hearing. As I listen, I am conscious of a heightened awareness of the flexing of empire, both old and new, and the very different trajectory of my writing life. I recall how my concerns as a young lawyer poet were held fast by the residues of British Empire. I read the British poets, Andrew Motion and Company, mostly male, the Caribbean poets and writers, mostly male, most, if not all, of whom were understandably oriented toward England. Brathwaite's pathless, harborless spade, with Sahara dust on her feet, trying to find a place to land on in the shadow of empire, epitomized the plight of the formerly colonized. Winter, Walcott, Lamming, César, C.L.R. James, and St. John's Pierce. These were the writers who engaged my imaginative and still incipient poetic life during those years. In my then still unimagined role of writer-poet, determined by a colonial childhood where we, descendants of the enslaved, sang of Britons who never, never, never would be slaves. One aspect of the mental luggage I had brought with me to Canada was important. One had to engage with the polity and be part of the struggle for liberation. The writer as public intellectual, long before the term became fashionable, it would throw a long shadow over my writing life.
Thank you, Leanne. I invite Nourbese to read her text.
Thank you so much, Leanne. That was so beautiful. And I just want to say how honored I am here today and what a deep honor it is to be in conversation with you, Leanne. What I'm going to read, excerpts at Leanne's that I received from Andrea, but I want to ask one thing, Leanne. How do you pronounce Namegos? It wasn't on the little recording. Namegos?
That's right, Namegos.
Okay, and I just love the little clips, you know, it's so beautiful. I was practicing it this morning, but I just want to say forgive, and I'm very sensitive about this, you know, because English is a foreign language, and I'm always so sensitive to not pronouncing other people's languages or even English the right way. So, excerpt from New Pimming, A Cure for White Ladies, Solidification. Once you move through cold, there is Pacific. Once you move through Pacific, there is placid. Once you move through placid, there is a condition of expanse. And it was that condition of expanse that held me. I heard them singing above me. Mashkawaji fell through the ice to find quiet, to get out of the wind, to visit the Namegos. They all sang. Mashkawaji stitches up the hole. They are so cold they can't move. They are frozen stiff. The lake is their blanket. They all sang. Mashkawaji is frozen stiff, still, calm. No one knows if they're coming back. They all sang. Akiwenzi is fishing through the ice with a spear. They brought a line of beads. They will wait patiently. They will wait until Mashkawaji is done their visit. The singing and drumming came every night from a distance. Different choirs every evening at dusk, marking the passage of time, reminding me there is love. You see, tragedy happened again. The details don't matter because the details are hopeless, overwhelmed, shut down. Know this, after 2 years, the best parts of me are still frozen in the lake. My limbic system, its best friend, the prefrontal cortex, and the hollow pumping organ in which I keep benevolence. The only one that regularly comes to visit is Akiwenzi. In the winter, they park their truck on the ice, drill a hole with the auger in the ice, and fish until the cold makes their bones crack. As soon as the ice is off the lake, Akiwenzi is back in their boat with a torch and a sort of pitchfork for spearing pickerel. In the dead of summer, Akiwenzi sneaks back before first light in their canoe, before the cottagers and their jet skis are out. In the fall, they sprinkle tobacco around me and sing. My world is muted. I look out. If something upsets me, I just wait and the upset passes. I sit beside. Sometimes I remember the other me before I was frozen in the lake. I remember caring and engaging and the sharpness of unmuted feeling. I remember a hopeless connection. I don't feel stuck, in part because I don't feel anything. Their song isn't wrong. The ice is like a warm, weighted blanket. My form dissolved when tragedy came, and if I am fluid, the ice is a container. There are ashes in my eyes. I am so far inside myself, like Miss Wadesi, painted turtle, on a full fast inside time, pulled inside their organs, inside their turtle self, inside shell, inside the sediments of the lake, while the ice world forms on top, oblivious to the outside with body as lake. And there is solace in being cut off. And there is freedom enmeshed within that state. Know this, being frozen in the lake is another kind of life. Know this, it is unclear how long before I will be done with my visit. It is unclear how long visiting takes. Know this, visiting is more of a dance than an event. Akiwenzi is my will. Ninatig is my lungs. Mindimoyin is my conscience. Sabe is my marrow. Adik is my nervous system. Asin is my eyes and ears. Lucy is my brain. I believe everything these seven say because ice distorts perception and trust replaces critique, examination, and interrogation. I believe everything these seven say, even though, I believe everything these seven say, even though their truths are their own, not mine. I believe in the absence of my own heart. I will accept the hearts of these 7. The geese fly overhead in the sheer grace of a carefully angled formation designed to take them elsewhere. There are still stars. There are still stars. Thank you. I think I'll end there. Just thank you so much for that poem.
Thank you, Nourbese. Thank you, Leanne. Thank you both for sharing your work. I just want to give some background as well. Nourbese and Leanne shared this work yesterday. And what was also really quite special was Leanne attached an audio file. So this idea of breathing, this idea of, yes, the breath in relation to language and relation to words became really quite palpable for me anyway. I know Nourbese is a writer, and I'll have her speak to her experience of hearing that and reading the text. But thanks for sharing your breaths with us today. And I'd like to start by going back to, I think, just 2 of the stanzas in Leanne's work to start the conversation. And it's the ones that go, I believe everything these 7 say, even though their truths are their own, not mine. I believe in the absence of my own heart, I will accept the hearts of these 7. So I'd like to talk about that in relation to this notion of the circularity of breath that comes out in Nourbese's work. And to use those 2 anchors, this breathing for, breathing with, breathing for oneself in relation to voice, to think about and think through ideas of care and what does it mean to reach out to the other from our places of our own pain and grief, to hold space and to breathe with for the other, as well as to breathe for oneself. So I will ask, Nourbese, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure that I will necessarily go straight to the question, but I want to speak about my experience with this poem. And I hope I can without crying, because so much of it, even though it comes from another reality, another experience, speaks to my own experience. So if I go to what you just identified, when I read, I believe everything these 7 say because ice distorts perception and trust replaces critique, examination, and interrogation. And even before that, those 7 words. For me, when I was repeating the words this morning earlier and then saying them, what it did for me was take me to this place of grief of not having any other language but English. And while I understand in this corporate capitalized world, having English, is useful, Akiwenzi is my will. And I would think, well, what word would it be in another African tongue for me? What is Sabe in my own language? I'll give you a short anecdote. I was with Lily Longfellow at a panel discussion some years ago at Nourbese, and we were talking, I forget the exact topic of the panel, but she took the English word and translated it into the word from her culture. And she then broke it down. And all I could do was just weep, because you really understand how language, which is actually breath linked to sound, linked to meaning, is so integral to us. And so, I don't know, my mind is just going over so many places. In terms of care, in terms of being able to hold the painful experience out of which this comes, because Indigenous peoples did have their languages affected. You know, many Indigenous people are now relearning their own tongues and so on. And I confess sometimes to being a little envious that, you know, that they can do that very easily here. And when I think of, you know, issues of reparation and so on, and, you know, you have people saying things like, oh, well, this is going to be so difficult to figure out what we're going to do. You know, how can we, you know, figure out? And as I was saying to my son last night, if we understand what was broken, it's really not that difficult to understand what has to be repaired. So what was broken? Language, spirituality. This statement, I believe everything these seven say, which to me grounds you in a certain kind of understanding of what these words are in your own tongue. I believe this. And then I don't know if this is what Leanne understood or intended, but, you know, once the poem is out there, we can interpret it. Ice distorts perception, and trust replaces critique, examination, and interrogation. And so those three words for me, in a way, encapsulate the sort of Euro-positive, Eurocentric way of approaching our lives. And I'm not, you know, I'm not dismissing that. There is value in that. But so much of our condition today is rooted in critique, examination, and interrogation of us as object and not as living, breathing being. So I don't think I've answered your question directly, but I just wanted to move into what that section, how it impacted me.
You did get around to the question, so thank you. I'm going to move it on to Leanne to actually to address some of these ideas around moving. I mean, Nourbese's brought out this idea of the reclamation of language and what that allows for, allowing particular breaths to be taken by those who've been disenfranchised. Actually, I should say by those who've had their language and their strength, who they are, taken away, forcibly taken away from them. So I won't couch it in language about lost. So the language and our cultures have been taken away from us. And I'm glad, Nourbese, you've placed it within that frame as well, being folks from Black folks, you know, who are here as stolen people and stolen lands, trying to reclaim those pieces within the context of a site in which the original people of these lands are engaged in much similar processes around their land base and culture. So Leanne, I'm going to pass it to you to talk about the ways in which language, writing, the breath, finding oneself within the framework of also re-engaging one's culture and making a very conscious decision to move outside of these your Western frameworks in which we've been trained to work within.
I think that passage, for me, on the one level, it was rooted in Anishinaabe ideas of truth and consensus. And so we have 7 different clans, which are animals or plants that we have relationships to, and that's how our nation is geographically kind of spread out over our territory. And when I use words like territory and nation, I don't mean nation state. I don't mean enclosures. I mean areas in time and space where we have very intense, intimate relationships with other forms of life. And so in my culture, everybody has their own truth, their own experiences, their own perceptions that are valid and that are to be believed. And they may change over one's lifetime, or they may change in different relationships, but those truths are sort of the core of your being. And in our language, our word for truth means the sound of your heartbeat, the sound of your beating heart. And so when we come together as communities to make decisions, we have to find a way of balancing those 7 groups of individual truths, individual self-determination, individual sovereignty, with the good of the whole. And so our processes, which are often ceremonial and political and emotional and intimate, for creating this consensus, involves individuals thinking through, what can I give up for the good of my community? And what are those things that I can't give up? What are those boundaries? And so I was thinking of that because in this novel, and it's a novel that doesn't conform to what a novel is supposed to be, because of course our lives don't fit into genres and disciplines. But in this novel, this main character, Mashkawaji, has experienced tragedy and is frozen, or is in that in-between space before they can take a breath. And they are therefore reliant on these 7 others to breathe for them as a temporary measure. And so I think that in those temporary spaces and in those spaces where we can't breathe for ourselves, we rely on our closest, trusted, intimate relationships. And those relationships are things that have to have been built and nurtured in the times where we can breathe, and deepened. And so for me, that's other humans, but it's also trees and plants. And I think a lot about trees and plants when I think about breath, because when I exhale, I'm exhaling carbon dioxide, and when they inhale, they're inhaling that carbon dioxide and releasing oxygen. And so I am in a circular breathing pattern, not just with other humans, but with other animals and other plants and everything that is living in the world. And that is I think, a practice that I do several times a minute, that connects me very intimately to all of the other living beings that I'm sharing time and space with, and also my ancestors, because it's those same atoms of oxygen that were in their lungs, and also to the future. So it's a very presencing practice. And we know it's a very presencing practice as soon as we start to let things like fear and anxiety, and right now during the pandemic, those things are so ubiquitous and so infectious. And where's the first place in my body I feel that is in my chest, in my ability to expand and contract and connect and release.
Can I say something to?
Yes, please.
I loved what you were saying there about breathing for others, because one of the things in terms of Andrea, in terms of the larger frame for the discussion about writing and how writing is a practice of care. But one of the things I felt probably after I was done working on Zong was that very much the work, and particularly the performance of it, is actually a breathing for those ancestors whose breathing was so brutally cut short, either by drowning or being brought to a foreign land. And that even when I think of something like reparations, I think of that as doing that on their behalf. It's not, because the discussion comes very quickly into, oh, how much money. To me, it's not a matter of money. It is a matter of exactly what Leanne just said. We're breathing for them. We have to do things for them that they weren't able to do. Long ago, I remember making notes about this, that memory serves many purposes. It could be nostalgia and so on, but I remember writing that maybe memory is also about grieving for those who couldn't grieve when they were breathing, and that we who were able to, as Leanne said, now can do some of that work for them. The time is really not as contained as we are taught. And I think all traditional cultures understand that. The past, present, and future are really very, very fluid. So I just wanted to say that echoes with me in terms of what I see my work being about. It's really about doing work on behalf of others who aren't here and who couldn't do that work for themselves.
Thanks for that. That's really quite beautiful in terms of this ongoing practice and process of always making sure that we are engaging in that circularity, as you mentioned. As you were speaking, you know, it really brought me also both of your discussion around the, you know, breath as being both voluntary and involuntary, and the ways in which we as humans have some sort of control over that process. And then it brings me back again to this title, the title of the talk. I'm very interested, as you know, Leanne, you're talking about the ways in which breath and breathing allows us a particular presence in relation to both the living and the non-living, and the kinds of interdependencies that are there between us as beings. But there's something about that space in between breath, and I'm using that as a metaphor, you know, that space in breathing, that I'm interested in thinking through with you as perhaps a really interesting space of productivity along the routes we're talking about in terms of the space of breathing for the other, caring for each other, and I should say, I'm trying not to use but too often, and a place for, I have no other language for this, but a kind of deep reflection as a way to be intentional as one continues through the process of breathing. Does that make sense to you in any way? I'm really interested in that pause and what it also might mean in terms of the kinds of pauses and introspection and thinking through of the histories of the present, of the past and the present in this moment. I wondered if that pause there might serve as something productive as a metaphor for us.
And the pause, Andrea, is the pause between?
Between, the pause.
And out breath.
Yes.
That's an interesting.
I think for me, when you were talking, I was thinking about what I'm doing right now, what my breath is doing right now. It's pausing, it's taking space, it's slowing things down, it's disconnecting from the anxiety of capitalism and the anxiety of colonialism, and it's setting, you can set up a boundary between you and the outside world by just disconnecting, lengthening that pause, doing, and then taking a deep breath. And I think that's a not a metaphor, but then also also a metaphor. Sometimes I think in the continual violent attack that we experience as communities, that space is taken away from us and we are constantly reacting. And so I think when you grow up and that's continually going from tragedy to tragedy, then you live in the world in a very particular way that makes it very difficult to connect and to relate, and almost impossible to breathe for someone else. So I think one of the things that just focusing and thinking on breath and how vital that is, and how I have the privilege of my life where most situations I'm in, I can control that, control how I breathe. I can use that breath to take and hold space.
Thank you. Nourbese? do you need to like to chime in?
I was just thinking, I did a meditation this week with a woman. I had done it many years ago when I was writing residence at University of Windsor. She's a South Asian woman for whom meditation is her life, and so during the pandemic, she hasn't been doing it, and she recently started this group, and I thought, wow, okay, I'll try it. And, she said something that was very interesting, because she talks throughout the meditation, not talks, but, guides you. And she said something about that space between the in-breath and the out-breath being a place of potential eternity. I don't understand that. I confess to that. But as Leanne was talking, and in response to your question, I was looking at the word gasp and the parenthesis of the S. And if you take that out, it becomes a gap.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking about just the actual process of breathing, that you take in air, oxygen, and then you breathe it out. And whether that rhythm, and you talked about, you being Andrea, you mentioned past, present, and future. So I'm going to kind of link it to that, that I'm trying to think, like, maybe, is it possible to think of what we're doing right now, like all the statues coming down? I just have to say, like, Columbus coming down, Mr. Coulson in Bristol, please allow me to just have a moment of, allow me to have a moment of joy there. But I'm wondering if this is a kind of, in some way, a collective exhaling of a kind of CO2 that is toxic, that has been poisonous. We know that it's going to take a lot more work than that, but these are like little, like, to use the sort of, to my mind, the foundation of poets and poetry, the metaphor. Maybe we're kind of collectively trying to exhale something that has been so toxic for us. So that was one thought I had. And as I thought of past, present, future, I'm thinking of a quotation by Octavio Paz, the Latin American writer, who said something to the effect that, we usually think of, we have to remember the past and imagine the future. And he sort of flipped that and wrote that what we need to do is imagine the past, the better to remember the future, which I think links with this whole idea of the 7 generations that Indigenous people talk about. If we remember the future. And so I see those ideas almost as sort of flowing like breath does, the inhale, the pausing, almost like holding one's breath and then exhaling, and then we take another breath, and so it goes. Just sort of random thoughts in response to your question that we'll probably connect later on when I think more on it.
I'm looking at the time, it's 3 minutes to 2. So I'm going to ask, I'm going to follow up on something that you both said. And then I'll ask Tanya, we should open it up for some broader discussion. You two women, I've followed your work, I know your work. And, I posed this question to you yesterday and we didn't really get into it, but I'd like to follow up on it, in which you've made some decisions, some very personal decisions, to move away from being in the center of a kind of Eurocentric space, to find your breath elsewhere through your writing, but also through your engagement with other kinds of communities and other ways of doing things. And, I feel like it's really important for us to talk about the politics in these very personal, what seems to be personal decisions, in a much more collective way. And I think this moment asks for it. So I'm going to ask you if you could please share the kinds of moves you've had to make in order to find that space to breathe.
Leanne, do you want to go, or would you want me to go? She's okay.
Go ahead.
I also didn't want to use the word self-care. because a lot of people take those kinds of movements as self-care, although it is part of that basket. I'm trying to get outside of this idea of self-care. Back to the ideas we talked about before in relation to breathing with and for others.
Okay, so I'll just take a quick stab at it. So I practiced, from what Leanne read, I came to Canada. I didn't actually intend to immigrate here. I just came to study, and life kind of takes over. And 40 years later, I wonder, what am I still doing here? But then after doing a master's, went into law and practiced law for 7 years. And when I decided to leave law I had been writing poetry, not really thinking that I could do anything with it. But once I decided to leave law, and I did law because my father had wanted to become a lawyer and didn't ever. And I think I was just finishing his business. Again, that idea of breathing for the other, although it wasn't he didn't demand that of me. I think it was just something in the family dynamics that I thought I would do. But over the years, there's always been this, I should go and do a PhD because that is now the path. And, I've said this a lot because my training in law was such that they really work on your thinking in a very profound way. And I can only speak about myself. They actually change the way you think, and it is irrevocable. You can't go back to how you were before. And I was very much aware of, the language of law and what had happened in my mind. And it seemed to me that to go into a PhD again would be to sort of enter another discipline. It took me about 7 years to clear my mind of of that language. And then I thought, well, to go into another discipline. But it's something that I'm always very anxious about, because at times I feel that I have to protect a way of thinking that I feel if I had entered into another discipline would have been affected. At times I feel I have a sort of disfluency, as in DYS, disfluency, because I don't have that language of the academy, but I've consciously tried to resist that often. So it's a very personal struggle. And I use the word struggle because, my work is used in university, so I have to enter those spaces. And then it's always the anxiety, of, I don't sound like the academic, and so on. So I'll just pause there and say that it has been a very, very personal thing, struggle for me, and it's something that I still think about. But I really feel that I said to somebody the other day, it's like I have a waywardness of thinking that I want to protect, and that I think the academy does some things very well. I'm not dissing the academy, although there's room for a lot of critique. It does some things really, really well. But for instance, Glissant, I'll end after this. I began reading Glissant years ago and had to put him aside because it was almost like he was too close to what I was trying to work out. And then when I was done with Zong and I read him 2 or 3 years ago, it was such a different experience. And it was like I was having this almost erotic relationship with this text because I had done the work. And so in the margins, I'm writing back to the text and to him as to what I had found out in Zong. Now, that's just my idiosyncrasy. Had I been in university, I would have been forced to read this text, write about it, so on and so forth. I just use that as an example of some of the little gifts that come to me. But there's a downside. I don't have a big pension from a university, and one has to survive,
I think that I have really similar thoughts. It was a very personal decision, and it was also tied to a protection of the way that I wanted to think, the way that I thought, the way that I wanted to learn how to think, and the work that I wanted to do in the world. And so I I do have a PhD from a time where there was very few Indigenous people in the academy, and there was very little structure around it in the late 1990s. And I quit a tenure track position 2 years in, about 18 years ago now, to very purposefully, ethically and politically base my practice of life outside the academy. And again, I have respect for my friends and colleagues that are radical academics that are working very hard to expand and change the system. But for me, that system, it felt like it was killing the parts of me that that were most vital to who I was. It was killing my voice. And I know that I have the body of work that I do today because of that decision, because of that. That rigor or excellence. I've been extraordinarily lucky to have been able to base my practice in the communities and the lived experiences of Indigenous people and people of color and Black people, and those folks that are concerned primarily with building otherwise, building this other world, not fixing the world that we have right now and tinkering around with our institutions, but fundamentally building a different world. And I think I mean, that's worth more than all the money in the world. That's worth putting up with the gig economy for. That's what gives me, that's what allows me to carry on and to breathe and to have hope. And I'm thankful that I've had colleagues that have brought me into their classes and hooked me up with students and used my work. But I'm pretty happy on the margins.
Thank you both.
Can I just say one quick thing? I read an interview that someone had done with you, Leanne, and I was really excited at a particular part where you said something was being edited, and you noticed that they were sort of editing it into a sort of very Eurocentric way, and it really excited me. Yes, this is it's those things that I think are so vital. And years ago, I remember thinking of going to do a with nation language. I just knew it would not be respected. This is long before so on, you know? So it's very important to I'm very happy I made those choices. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, although you don't have a pension, I'm really happy you've made this. Work with your work, both of your works, and just hearing you answer this question too fills my heart. To hear this kind of discussion, to know that it's possible. I know it's possible through your work. I know I said I was going to open this up, but I really have one other burning question to ask you both. And I'll just follow off of what you said, Leanne, about this practice of building a better world. I want to have a little bit of a conversation between you two about what you see, what you think might be the ways in which we can speak across our two divides that come together, which is, us Black folks from the Caribbean being stolen people on the stolen land, and how can we think through practices and strategies with Indigenous folks at this moment in time, thinking about the past, thinking about where we are, with the vision of building a better world now and in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks, and then we'll open it up. Thank you, people, for allowing me to ask that question before I open it up.
I'll start with reading Leanne's work, and not simply reading it all, because there were 3 poems that were sent. I read the first one, or 3 excerpts. There's so much of what I was reading as I read it out loud that landed in me. It wasn't simply I'm reading about that other experience, but it was as if I was reading about my own experience as well, although we come from very different places. It was an absolute gift. I'm so glad we thought of this yesterday, to do that, because it took me into a place of inhabiting the other's, not, I want to say reality, but inhabiting this moment of this poem. I don't come from a land where cold is essential. Instead of it, I come from the hot tropics. But once I moved through the cold, I understood something about what was happening. But to speak to the larger topic, my feeling is that, it concerns me still when I hear, and over the last few days I've heard, various people in the US and so on talking, mainly the US, talking about the situation in the US. And Charlemagne the God was on some program. He's a musician, poet. And he said, the original sin of the US was slavery. And I said, no. And my son and I had this discussion because, we're saying, look, they had to have the land. They couldn't do what they did to us unless they had the land, So there's still work to be done there. And I see what has happened to us as two tranches of the same thing, right? So the fruit is rotten to the core because of these 2 things. They could not bring us without taking the land. Without that, the rest of it is not possible. So for me, some of that work still has to be done. Very much so. I think there are a lot of, in my community, I know people understand that very clearly. And I want to be able to speak across that to so can we begin to see, we were used, the Buffalo Soldiers were used to hunt indigenous people. The 5 civilized tribes held us as slaves. Like, really, what are we talking about? It's the flip side of the same coin. I say unfortunately because I feel, and maybe I'm wrong here, I feel there's such us being in a land that's not our own, not having the resources. I remember saying to a friend of mine many years ago, Alice Williams, she comes from the Peterborough Clove Lake Reserve. She's a quilter. And I remember saying to her years ago, sometimes when I hear I was walking past this little brook and I heard the water. And I said to her, this is going back many years, I can actually hear the sounds of native languages in the water. Do you know? And I know that, again, coming back to sound and breath and so on, and it would have happened in Africa as well, where the sounds around you then come into you. And so for me, I think that is something that we as African descended folks have to work with. How can we create something here? How can I come to you, offer you my pain, receive your pain, and can we sit together and breathe together in pain and then in resolution? That's how I see it, is there a ceremony that we could construct? When I say ceremony, in the sense of, could we work together where we could almost like reenact, you know, like reshape the past in terms of, we are here on your land. How can we honor that? How can we be here as people who had no responsibility in being brought to this part of the world? And many of us long to go back to where we can't ever go back to. I don't have any answers. I merely have responses.
Thank you, and that's what we need, some responses. Leanne, thank you so much, Nourbese. Leanne.
That was so beautiful. That I know Alice Williams as well, and thank you for sharing that that story. I think that every time Robin Maynard and I get together, we talk about Nourbese Philip, and we talk about this one quote that we both cite all the time, that talks about the founding of the Americas is based on 2 genocides. And for me, that was a very, very affirming statement that you made, and one that I've carried with me and brought forth into my work as a way of also affirming Black experiences. And so I think this idea of writing with care in mind, the act of being seen, the act of having one's pain or one's experience affirmed by someone else who understands it, I think started building a relationship before I met you today on Zoom. And so last February, Robin and some of the organizers of the Black Lives Matter Freedom School, we brought them up to Jacinta in the Northwest Territories in the middle of winter for a solidarity gathering. And they were so brave, and they were such good sports. We canoed them out across the frozen lake. And we spent time on Mackenzie Island. And again, this was the quote that we talked about as a group, and that affirmation and this idea that Robin and I have been talking about as these interlocking projects of justice. And so from that affirmation, it makes me think about, how do we build worlds? How do I build worlds? How do I build an Anishinaabe world that rejects anti-Blackness, that rejects heteropatriarchy, that rejects capitalism, that rejects transphobia, while also supporting the self-determination of those communities to build worlds that have so much care at their foundation that there is no need for things like the police. There is no need for enclosure. There is no need for these colonial systems of control and surveillance. And so I think that I think, to go back to breath, that idea of breathing together and acknowledging someone else's breath, and sitting together on the land, and walking the land with Alice, and noticing that you can hear the sounds of our language in that river. I think that's the beginning, that's the foundation. Because we have an incredible amount of brilliance in these communities. And I just think what gives me hope is the idea of these 2 bodies of brilliance combining, and the worlds we'll make.
Thank you, Leanne. Thank you. So we're opening it up. Actually, there is a really interesting response from Lisa Myers. And instead of me reading, I think it'd be good for us to hear her breath.
So Lisa, could you please just speak what you've
Sure.
written, please?
Sure, I'll just read what I wrote because I don't know. I just want to say thanks for this conversation. And an idea came to my mind right, like as you were speaking about breath as a key part of voice. And I'm thinking about response and responsibility and responding. And I'm thinking
Comments from both of you? Or do you feel, Lisa, do you feel that your ideas that you put out here about responsibility, do you need any response, or we can move on to?
I kind of feel like as I was sort of thinking about this question, everything that they were you were both talking about was actually kind of responding to that. So it's sort of happened. It's all done. Thank you.
Yeah. So I'll ask Jen. Jen, you've put out a question here. Would you also like to speak? You're Jen Master, Ray Jen Master.
Hi, yeah, Jenny. Hi. So we're kind of talking a lot about partnerships and about trying to get away from the sense of, the self being in the center. So and as a writer, sometimes you go through collaborative processes and editing processes. And when that happens, there's this kind of, there can be like a going away from the ego. It's like a different kind of writing process. I'm wondering if you guys have done much kind of collaborative writing. That's it. Thanks.
Nourbese?
I've collaborated with the ancestors. Okay, in terms of writing, what I would say is one of the things I tell younger writers is that there's always a struggle between the poem or the story that you want to write or you think you want to write and the story, poem, whatever, that has to write itself through you. And that I think, certainly for me in terms of writing, it has been a process of trying to get rid of the ego. So it doesn't even have to do with collaboration necessarily. It is, can you step aside enough to let what has to come and come through you come, And one example I usually give is when I was doing Zong, the voice of this European man was there all the time, and I didn't want it in my text. I thought, we've heard from you enough, but the way I was doing the work, the voice just kept surfacing, and I had to, in a way, submit, not to him, but submit to the process of, I took my ego out. And I realized that by the end, he then kills himself at the end of the text. And I realized that that was what had to happen, that in allowing him to come into the text, he then realizes that he has sort of crossed the line and that his redemption depends on him killing himself and a way of life and joining his victim, So I think it has less to do with collaboration and more to do, I think, with the process of art itself, of creating art, that there's always this tension there of what you want to do and what wants to do itself through you. Does that help you?
I think I can relate to a lot of what Nourbese is saying, working with young Indigenous writers, that a lot of time there's that colonial anxiety is in their head and prevents them from having a voice. So every time they get up to read their work, that you're not good enough, you don't have anything to say, who do you think you are, comes in. So part of my work, I think, is to help those younger writers, to help myself shut those voices down, and let those voices of the ancestors, or let your own experience come through, to give yourself permission to tell your truth in a way that might make lots of people, might make whiteness feel uncomfortable, but give yourself the permission to tell yourself the truth. And so I think that's the first sort of layer to that, is helping people find their voice, and finding our own voice, and continually finding that voice and inserting it unapologetically, no matter what. So that means often me arguing with a lot of my so-called collaborators to make sure that actually, even though that's grammatically incorrect, no Indigenous person on a reserve would ever say it that way. So my character can't say it that way. They'd get run right out of the place. So I think that's the first layer. The second layer is that I want my work, I mean, I made a very conscious decision to write work for Anishinaabe people first, for Brown people first, for Black people first, and not center whiteness in my work. And so that has meant for me that I want my work to be in conversation with other writers and other thinkers and other doers. And so I like the idea of setting work, whether it's creative work or academic work, that's in conversation, and is a thinking through together, a thinking alongside, because I find that a very inspiring and generative process. Yeah.
Thank you so much. So
Thank you.
thank you so much. This has been amazing, amazingly generative. And I am so glad that we are ending on this note of really thinking through what Carrie-Anne Young and I had been discussing in another session, around things like, what is the reach of your writing? Who are you writing for? To make these really intentional decisions as writers. And Leanne, as you were saying also, what I'm even drawing out of it is being really intentional about the politics of citation. Who are you citing? Who are you writing for? What kind of histories are we pulling ahead with us? What kind of histories are we dropping and leaving behind because they're no longer useful for helping us to think forward? So thank you everyone. Thank you so much. I would love to continue this conversation, and given how we've set up and the vision for this project called the Summer Residency, this conversation will continue. I know it. It will continue, hopefully in person at some point, but the kinds of connections we've made and the ideas that we're teasing out, just really, really, they're feeding my soul. So I'm speaking for myself right now, and the importance of this conversation to me as a Black woman in the time of COVID, and the need for this kind of conversation and this kind of gathering and thinking through what our relationalities might look like, can look like, will look like, is just really, really important. So I don't know how else. I don't know how to thank you for this, but thank you very much. And thank you for all who are here participating. And again, if you have any questions, comments, continue to send them in, please. It's not the end, it's just the beginning. So be well, you all. Thank you. Thanks, Tanya, for hosting, co-hosting. And be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Can you hear me? Oh, because somehow I've lost the screen. But anyway, thank you so much to all of you. And Leanne, it was just such a deep pleasure to have met you and to have read your work and to read your work out loud. Oh, I don't know how to get back to seeing you all before I say goodbye. Oh, there you are. Okay, bye.
Thank you, Nourbese and Tanya and Andrea and everyone who came. This was a beautiful, amazing, very, very powerful brilliant conversation, and I hope we get to do it again.
Yeah, I want to thank you all and acknowledge just all the ancestors, lands, and waters that we all brought to this virtual space, which I think needs it.
Thank you, Tanya.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrea, Leanne, Lisa.
Bye.
I'm up.
Bye, Lisa. Bye, Peter.